Robot. Drawing upon the bohemian characteristics towards which both Tom Baker and producer Barry Letts were inclined, costume designer James Ackerson assembled an outfit for the new Doctor which unconsciously echoed the 1892 Aristide Bruant lithographs of French artist Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec. One of the elements inspired by Toulouse-Lautrec was a scarf, and Ackerson secured the services of an elderly woman named Begonia Pope to knit it. Misunderstanding Ackerson's instructions, Pope used all of the wool he had supplied, resulting in an inordinately long piece of netwear. Baker, however, liked the image this conveyed, and although its length was eventually reduced, it was agreed that the scarf could be incorporated into the on-screen action and make a rather effective prop. The Ark in Space. On February 1st, The Ark in Space Episode 2 drew 13.6 million viewers to finish 5th amongst all UK programmes for the week. This was the highest chart position yet achieved in the history of Doctor Who, and was just the first sign of the incredible success Tom Baker would help inspire. The Sontaran Experiment. On September 29th, Tom Baker slipped on a patch of wet grass while filming the Doctor's confrontation with Steyer at the area where Sarah was restrained. Recording halted immediately, forcing the abandonment of a handful of scenes, including one in which the Doctor found Harry and they heard Sarah screaming. Tom Baker had to be carried back to the nearest car and driven to hospital, where it was discovered that he had cracked his collarbone. Luckily, he was able to recover. Genesis of the Daleks. Whilst this serial is considered to be the universally agreed origin story for the Daleks, other origin stories for the Pepper Potts predate 1975. Starting in 1965, writer Terry Nation and former Doctor Who script editor David Whittaker expanded on these notions in a comic strip running in the TV Century 21 magazine. They reveal that the Daleks were the result of an experiment conducted by the scientist Yarveling, who was now described as a member of the Dalek race. However, in a 1973 edition of the Radio Times, Terry Nation's short story, We Are the Daleks, instead posited that the Daleks were created on Amaron by scientists from Halden, who had accelerated the evolution of early man. All of these were changed for the TV series. Revenge of the Cybermen. While scouting the complex, director Michael Bryant's wife Monique discovered several Iron Age arrowheads in the sand, which she kept as a souvenir. Some crew members would come to believe that this precipitated a chain of strange occurrences and bad luck which beset the production. The first event attributed to this curse occurred later in the reconnaissance trip, when director Michael Bryant encountered an individual dressed in spelunking gear late one night. The Wookiee whole staff had no knowledge of this man, and Michael Bryant came to believe that this was actually the ghost of an Irish potholer who had perished in the caves 3 years earlier. Terror of the Zygons. Space 1999, which was being developed for the rival ITV network, was all set for a September 1975 debut and would run until the spring of 1976. Furthermore, this could potentially air on Saturday evenings, just like Doctor Who. Should Space 99 prove to be the massive hit that was being forecast, this would give it a 4-month jump on the premiere date for the next season of Doctor Who, which, since 1970, had fallen in late December or early January. To maintain Doctor Who's visibility and potentially blunt the ratings for Space 99, it was decided around January 1975 that Season 13 would be brought forward to start in the late summer or early autumn, as had been the case throughout most of the 60s. This meant that the 13th recording block, which wouldn't normally start until September, would have to begin a lot earlier. Planet of Evil. Production designer Roger Murray Leach was given the freedom to design a fabulously detailed, exotic and alien jungle set at Ealing to represent the surface of Zeta Minor for filming on June 11th and 12th. This set proved so successful that it was extensively photographed by the BBC Educational Services, which would use it as an example of design excellence for years afterwards. Pyramids of Mars. Location filming for this story took place on the grounds of Stargroves, a manor house in the East End, Hampshire, which would pose as the exterior of the priory and its environment. At the time, the property was owned by none other than Mick Jagger, lead singer of the Rolling Stones, and was currently occupied by his parents. The Android Invasion. Rejoining Doctor Who for the studio recordings were Ian Marter as Harry Sullivan and John Levine as R.S.M. Benton. Ian Marter had just wrapped up his regular role on the series in April at the end of the previous production block, and it had been planned that Harry would continue to be seen in Doctor Who on occasion, but the Android Invasion would prove to be his final appearance. For John Levine, this serial marked the last in a series of regular appearances dating back to 1968. Neither Ian Marter nor John Levine found the android invasion a pleasant experience, as the new production team's de-emphasis of the unit form was now very apparent. John Levine also missed Nicholas Courtney's presence on set. The Brain of Morbius. For Part 4's mind-bending sequence, crew members for both The Brain of Morbius and The Seeds of Doom, the next serial in production, were dressed in period garb and pressed into service. They included producer Philip Hinchcliffe, script editor Robert Holmes, director Christopher Barry, The Seeds of Doom director Douglas Camfield, its writer Robert Banks Stewart, and production manager George Galacchio. A shot of production assistant Graham Harper taken during the making of 1971's Colony in Space, and which he was dressed in the Adjudicator outfit worn by Roger Delgado, was also repurposed. The Seeds of Doom. As a cost-saving measure, the costume for the humanoid version of the Crinoid was adapted from an Axon outfit, originally created for 1971's The Claws of Axos. The major alteration was a change in colour scheme from orange to green. The Mask of Mandragora. Designer Barry Newbury also called upon to design a new interior for the TARDIS, after producer Philip Hinchcliffe concluded that the control room set introduced in the previous season was too big and cumbersome for recording. He was also frustrated by the technical problems which perpetually plagued the central column and the main doors. Barry Newbury created a smaller, more practical set, dispensing with the clinical whiteness of the original Peter Gracacki design in favour of a wood panel look inspired by sci-fi author Jules Verne. Its overall configuration remained essentially the same, retaining round doors, a scanner screen, and a slimmed-down console. The Hand of Fear. Whilst notable for being the last regular appearance of companion Sarah Jane, it was suggested that writers Bob Baker and Dave Martin's story might be an opportunity for the Doctor's longtime ally, Brigadier Lethbridge Stewart, to go out in a blaze of glory. The Deadly Assassin. Mary Whitehouse of the National Viewers and Listeners Association had been a thorn in the show's side throughout the 1970s, and had escalated her attacks on the suitability of its content since the start of 1975. Mary Whitehouse was at her most strident in her condemnation of the protracted drowning scene at the end of episode 3. She even quoted one child who had allegedly told his mother that he would do the same to his younger brother the next time the boy angered him. This would result in stories for season 15 being toned down in violent content. The Face of Evil. Script editor Robert Holmes' tentative plan for the Doctor's next companion was to introduce a Victorian street urchin character, likely in the season finale. Although not completely opposed to this idea, producer Philip Hinchcliffe preferred a strong, more relatable female protagonist. Whilst reading a draft of Chris Boucher's episode 2 script in mid-March, the producer hit upon a potential compromise. He appreciated Leela's self-assurance, while her primitive and childlike nature were akin to Robert Holmes' concept, resulting in everyone's favourite savage Leela taking the companion role. The Robots of Death. Ahead of serial's transmission, some press reports suggested that Pamela Salem was joining Doctor Who as another new companion. In fact, however, these stories were contrived by the actress's publicist. There had never been any intent to retain the character Toos beyond the Robots of Death. The Talons of Weng Chiang. Writer Robert Banks Stewart was commissioned to write the season 14 finale, The Foe from the Future. Script editor Robert Holmes left on a family vacation, comfortable that the rest of the season was now proceeding towards production. Unfortunately, while near Munich en route to Italy, Robert Holmes' wife took ill with a perforated ulcer, forcing an extended stay in Germany. Finally returning to England in August, Holmes discovered that the writer had left him a message for him to explain that he had taken a new position as script editor on a Thames television programme called Rooms. As a result, he would be unable to write the scripts for The Foe from the Future. With little time remaining to find a replacement, it was agreed that Robert Holmes would have to write the season finale himself. With no certainty that either member of the production team would remain on Doctor Who for another year, producer Philip Hinchcliffe encouraged Holmes to write whatever he wanted, and the results were pretty golden. Horror of Fang Rock. Rehearsals for this story marked a turning point in the relationship between Louise Jameson and Tom Baker. To date, Tom Baker had been dismissive of his co-star because he felt that Leela's violent tendencies were inappropriate for Doctor Who, and because he did not want to be saddled with a companion of any sort. By now, Louise Jameson had appeared on Doctor Who long enough that she was beginning to stand up for herself and her character, which finally prompted Tom Baker to apologise for his attitude. The Invisible Enemy. notably the first story to introduce the Doctor's best friend, robot dog, K9. Writer Dave Martin was a dog lover who had recently suffered the loss of 2 pets beneath the wheels of vehicles. The new character was inspired by the notion that had his dogs been built like a tank, they would have survived the accidents. Originally, the writers conceived the name Fido, which in the phonetic vernacular of the script stood for Phenomenological Indication Data Observation Unit. Pluto was also considered, but was quickly rejected for fear of confusion with the Walt Disney cartoon character of the same name, after which the robot dog was christened K9. Image of the Fendal. This serial became the inadvertent cause of one of Doctor Who's most notorious fan myths. For years after the transmission of Season 15, it was believed that a story called The Island of Fandor had been dropped at the last minute. In fact, Gordon Blows of the recently formed Doctor Who Appreciation Society had misheard the title of Image of the Fendal during a telephone conversation. The garbled version was then printed in the pages of the Dwas publication TARDIS, from which it entered into fan lore. The Sunmakers. One of the challenges faced by the production team was to find a roof which could serve as a suitable location for the top of the towering Megropolis 1. To be suitable, such a location would have to provide an empty skyline to give the correct impression of height. Unfortunately, despite many attempts, no appropriate building could be found in the vicinity of London. The problem was finally solved by production assistant Leon Arnold, who recommended the WD and H.O. Wills Tobacco Factory in Hartcliffe, Bristol. Although not particularly tall, it was very wide, which would achieve the appropriate effect. Facing pressures from his superiors to control Doctor Who's budget, producer Graham Williams was not keen on travelling such a distance for such a handful of scenes, and suggested that they should instead be performed in the studio via chroma key. However, director Pennant Roberts discovered that the Wills Tobacco Factory offered other locations which could replace studio sets, such as a very long tunnel, and this enabled him to justify the cost of the trip. Underworld. Despite the production problems which had plagued this story, Bob Baker and Dave Martin remained enthusiastic about the scenario they had created. For a time, they had considered spinning off the R1C crew into their own science fiction program, in which the minions would travel through space and become involved in new adventures based upon other tales drawn from ancient mythology. Ultimately, however, nothing came of this idea. The Invasion of Time. On July 18, 1977, writer David Weir was commissioned to write Killers of the Dark. It introduced a race of cat people living outside the Time Lord capital, whose society was defined by both brutal savagery and technological sophistication. David Weir had to write quickly to meet the serial's mid-October production dates, and submitted his first 5 scripts on August 15th. Due to inflation and production costs, however, this serial was abandoned. The Reboss Operation. A serious incident occurred during rehearsals for the second studio block. One lunchtime, several members of the cast went to a hotel for drinks. They were accompanied by George, a Jack Russell Terrier owned by Paul Seed, who played the Graf Vindicay. Tom Baker started trying to get George to perform a trick in which the dog would leap up to snatch a sausage from between his lips. Unfortunately, George inadvertently bit Tom Baker, necessitating a trip to hospital to treat a deep cut on the left side of his lip. Tom Baker was forced to wear a large plaster cast, which was plainly visible in some of the publicity photos for the Reboss Operation. The wound had to be concealed using makeup during the final studio session. Fortunately, the nature of the remaining scenes meant that Tom Baker's face could often be partially hidden, so that continuity with the previously taped material was not completely lost. The Pirate Planet. Writer Douglas Adams suggested that the segment of the Key to Time might be disguised as a piece of rubbish. Knowing his sense of humour, I can't help but find that funny. The Stones of Blood. This would be the 100th Doctor Who serial. Because episode 1 was underrunning, it was agreed that an extra scene would be added in which Romana and K9 celebrated the Doctor's 751st birthday, complete with a cake and a present, a new scarf identical to the one the Doctor was already wearing. This scene was dropped for being too self-congratulatory, in spite of a specially made cake being ordered. The Androids of Tara. Unusually, the opening credits for this story were recorded such that the episode number appeared prior to the writer's name, rather than the other way round. I have no idea why this was done. The Power of Kroll. Late in the year, the British TV industry was rocked by the latest in a virtually annual succession of labour disputes. Not only did this delay the final dubbing of the last 3 episodes until days before transmission, but it also threw the schedule into doubt, as BBC One, BBC Two and ITV all experienced interruptions due to strike action. The Armageddon Factor. Originally, the Shadow's own Shadow turned out to be the 6th segment of the Key to Time. Destiny of the Daleks. The Daleks' destruction of the Doctor's barrier had to be refilmed when smoke from the explosion was sucked into the fan built into Davros's chair. A visiting Doctor Who aficionado named Kevin Davies was accused of changing the setting on the fan. Years later, Davies would direct various Doctor Who projects, beginning with the 1993 documentary Doctor Who 30 Years in the TARDIS. City of Death. In accepting the role, actor Julian Glover had made it clear that he was not willing to don a mask to play the Jagaroff version of Scaroff, and so walk-on Richard Sheekey was hired for these sequences. Glover later relented for a handful of shots, and was surprised to find that wearing the mask was much less unpleasant than he had anticipated. The Creature from the Pit. Many of the names chosen for the storyline were derived from Greek mythology. Lady Adrasta was inspired by the legend of Andromeda, whose homeland was plagued by a gargantuan sea monster. Writer David Fisher christened his creature Erato, after a member of the group of goddesses called the Muses. This choice was intentionally ironic. The mythological Erato was the muse of erotic poetry, and her name meant lovely. Nightmare of Eden. This serial would signal a changing of the guard for Doctor Who. Not only would this prove to be Bob Baker's final contribution, but it also inspired both members of the production team to step away from the show. Script editor Douglas Adams had been frustrated by the struggle to recruit new writers, and he had realised that he preferred working on his own projects rather than cultivating other people's scripts. Furthermore, he was now developing various iterations of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy for different media, leaving little time for other work. For his part, Graham Williams had endured 3 embattled years on Doctor Who, and following the atmosphere associated with Nightmare of Eden, he had finally had enough. The Horns of Nimon. Rather infamously, actor Graham Crowden mistook the recording of Soldeed's demise for a camera rehearsal and began to laugh hysterically. With time passing, and despite the fact that director Kenny McBain was already concerned that Crowden was overacting in the part, the shot was retained. Sharda. Many versions of this unfinished Doctor Who serial have surfaced over the years. One version that never saw the light of day was proposed in 1985. In November 1985, producer John Nathan Turner mooted the possibility of having the 6th Doctor, Colin Baker, fill in the missing material either with linking narration or on-screen segments in which he would be telling the story of Sharda to his companion Perry, played by Nicola Bryant. Nothing really came of these ideas, however. The Leisure Hive. This serial was substantially over budget, ensuring that director Lovett Bickford would never work on Doctor Who again. Meglos. The name Brotadak was jokingly devised as an anagram of bad actor. Full Circle. When new Doctor Who script editor Christopher H. Bidmead began reviewing the programme's files in early 1980, his attention was drawn to a storyline entitled The Planet That Slept. It was written by Andrew Smith, who had been encouraged to submit material for the series by several of Bidmead's predecessors. Bidmead was urgently seeking ideas for Doctor Who's 18th season, and he and producer John Nathan Turner both wanted to recruit new writers to the show. As such, he invited Andrew Smith to a meeting in February to discuss guiding The Planet That Slept into a more suitable form. What Bidmead did not anticipate was that Andrew Smith was in fact a 17-year-old Doctor Who fan. State of Decay. Christopher Bidmead changed the title to The Wasting because he wanted the inclusion of vampires to come as a surprise. Writer Terence Dix heavily disagreed. He felt that viewers would quickly deduce the nature of the villains, and he thought that the new title would leave the serial open to ridicule. The script editor was already unhappy with the storyline, which he felt ran contrary to the efforts he and Nathan Turner were making to ground Doctor Who in solid scientific concepts. The two men did find themselves butting heads as Bidmead had mentally tried to steer Terence Dix away from horror cliches. Luckily, they still remained on screen in the finished product, however. Warrior's Gate. The atmosphere during rehearsals was tense. Tom Baker and Lalla Ward, who had renewed their romantic relationship some weeks earlier, were fighting. Tom Baker had still not fully recovered from the illness he had endured since March, and his mood was further dampened by the imminence of Lalla Ward's departure from Doctor Who. Both actors were deeply unhappy with their dialogue, which resulted in several scenes being substantially overhauled. Lalla Ward also disliked the fact that Romana's final scene was written with such dispassion, but JNT and Bidmead were adamant that they did not want soap opera elements to creep into Doctor Who. The Keeper of Traken. Chris Bidmead became Doctor Who's script editor at the start of 1980, but he was not producer John Nathan Turner's first choice. This was Johnny Byrne, a regular writer for All Creatures Great and Small, on which JNT had been the production unit manager. Johnny Byrne was not willing to relocate from Norfolk to London in order to work on Doctor Who, but he did indicate his interest in providing scripts for the series. This led to a meeting between Bidmead and Byrne around the spring of 1980 to discuss story ideas that would eventually become The Keeper of Traken. Logopolis. The exterior of Tegan and Aunt Vanessa's house belonged to Andrew McCulloch, the co-writer of Meglos. And that's all for the 4th Doctor era. Join me next time as we enter the 1980s with the 5th Doctor. Bye bye.